Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
How
not
heroic
fucking
he
idiot.
comes
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
Oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Hello again. Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson. And today I have a really exciting conversation, something a little bit different than we're normally doing on the Sensible Socialist Podcast. But recently I've been, and if you've seen me on YouTube, you know that I'm a bit of a space nerd. And I've been doing a lot of work on the questions of political, social, cultural, economic considerations when it comes to a future Mars colony, because it's coming up pretty quick and human beings are going to be on Mars in the not too distant future. And so I want to talk about that. And I think actually that Mars, being the red planet, is actually a very fertile ground for a kind of socialism. And that can be an example that can reflect back to Earth and make significant changes back here. And as a part of that process, I've been connected with a lot of interesting people who are also thinking about this. And today's conversation is with one of those people. Allyson Kim is a graduate student at the Maryland Institute College of Art in the social design program. And she's working on a thesis talking about the design elements and social design of a Martian settlement, similar to what I'm dealing with in terms of the social, political, cultural, and economic considerations that might be taken into or must be taken into when it comes to a Martian settlement. And we were connected via some mutual contacts, and she reached out and just wanted to have a conversation. And I thought it would be a great conversation to be able to air to the rest of the world and to be able to hear us talk about these very interesting topics. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Allyson Kim. Allyson, it's a pleasure to talk to you. It's an interesting way of having been connected. I think that... I've made a lot of different connections over the years doing a lot of sort of different things, and I have a number of varied interests, but a lot of them center around a kind of focus on wanting to create a more just and equitable world, and the kind of different, and then I've got different interests in space and legal things specifically and stuff like that. And so I've been able to meet a lot of different people. And so, but I think I do have I guess in some ways an artistic background, mostly related to audio stuff in terms of music and music production and stuff like that. And I will admit to being not a great artist in the visual arts, but I'm also fascinated by, architecture and the relationship between architecture and political structures and things like that, and historical developments and all that kind of stuff. So when you reached out, or when we were connected, and your focus is on the question of design, I was pretty fascinated. I was like, yeah, okay, I want to sort of hear more about that, or how you kind of see the relationship between design and sustainability and equitability and stuff like that. And so I don't know if you just want to give a bit of a background to kind of let me kind of give an introduction in terms of how you came to this and where you're coming from. I think that'll be a good way to start off the talk.
Yeah, well, first off, I just want to thank you for being in connection with me. I was super excited because, as I mentioned before, I kind of have received a lot of resistance in my idea of addressing Mars settlement, and people are kind of like, that's not going to happen. But essentially, my background was in cultural entrepreneurship, in psychology and leadership, and what I was doing in my undergrad was trying to build equitable business models and to kind of bring humans away from the norm of looking at business as just a transaction, but actually something like a give and take between human beings and life. And so when I got into the social design program, I was really interested in imagining what the ideal world would look like, specifically by people who aren't included in the decision-making process. That usually we look at design as kind of a contract between someone with wealth and power and then the people that have the tools to do what they're contracted to do. So I became very curious about, well, if you start talking to all these different people, what does their world look like? What would their world look like? And I came across when I was doing a lot of research that this project has already been done millions of times by different people in different cities and different countries. Everybody seems to have a different vision of what their ideal world would look like. And then that led me to kind of think of, well, I remembered when everyone was going crazy and saying the world's going to end, we have to move to Mars. And then the billionaires and the scientists started moving super quickly. How can we get humans to get to a different planet? And they were settling on Mars and we're going to move to Mars. And so that made me think, well, what would the world look like on Mars? What would the ideal world look like on Mars? What would, if like the people that didn't have any say in the decision-making process created their own structural system, what would that look like in space? What would that look like on Mars? How would their life function? And then it came to the reality of, but usually the people that I want to target for kind of envisioning this imagination of life wouldn't have the power to choose what it would be like. It goes back to the billionaires and the governing people that have the power to choose what goes on. And that kind of just really led me to kind of see the sense of urgency. We're already planning to move to another planet, yet we can't even get like restructure the justice of society at Earth. So then what are we going to do once we get to Mars, and who is going to control that? So that's kind of where I've been in these past few weeks, is really researching and looking at the history of design and who has controlled design and why those decisions have been made. And I've been specifically studying kind of architecture and urban planning, and why do we have kind of programs that don't really serve the purpose that they say, not all of them, but a bunch of them that they say they want to do this and that, but it doesn't serve the function that it's supposed to be. And that's kind of where I got interested in Martian Settlement, and just really kind of wanting to advise people, you know, if we keep going down this path, it's going to just get worse and worse.
That's I mean, I feel a significant sort of kinship with that. I think for me it was very much the same thing. I've been interested in political change and wanting to I mean, sort of really radical revolutionary change, because I think that's what's ultimately necessary to get us away from what have become in many ways shackles and kind of fetters to the full expression of human beings being human beings and being able to participate in the ways that they can, in the ways that they want, and in ways that will allow them to feel, you know, not alienated and not even in some ways enslaved or again shackled to things that they don't have any control over or anything like that. And so for me, you know, much of that has been political. And I mean, when I was very young, I had first encountered Marx as a kind of major critique of the status quo, and although being confronted, you know, in American education system, you very quickly realize that like socialism bad, you know, communism bad, and it took a long time for me to realize that that is a kind of propaganda machine that is attempting to get you to kind of maintain those shackles and fetters. And so I think for me, reading that stuff, it can get really difficult and stuff like that, but the connection it has with looking at the development of human civilization, I think what you're seeing in terms of the architecture in particular and city planning, I mean, I think that there's this massive shift in humanity from the small sort of communal living, and mostly with like your kin and tribes and stuff like that for the majority of human history. And you have an agrarian revolution, and you begin to settle and create what we would call civilization in terms of like not moving around and staying there and building these social structures that relate to that very much come from this division of labor, and the division of labor being this beginning process of not only dividing horizontally in terms of different people doing different things, but also vertically in terms of who has positions of authority and how those positions of authority get represented not only in the beliefs and in the minds of people, but actually in the physical, material conditions of their lives. And I think it's a smart thing, and it's a proper thing to actually look at how the actual physical layout of cities and what becomes important. So when you go to Tenochtitlan, what's still there are the giant pyramids that were religious, facilities. I mean, much of what's left from ancient Rome is maybe the grid system of every city except for Rome, which is again its own kind of interesting situation. But it's a lot of religious temples and things like that. But in the Roman times, the combination between religious and civil authority was not as disconnected as it is now. And so I think that you often see in literally the way that things look and in terms of buildings and things like that. I mean, I used to live in Washington, D.C., and you look around the buildings and it's intentionally echoing a kind of Greco-Roman style in order to convey this long connection. And much of it is maybe a veneer, but it's also attempting to communicate something that that really is part of how society is structured. And so when it comes to, I think for me, there's just this space nerd aspect of me that was fascinated in Mars because, it's the sort of frustration of having gone to the moon and not stayed, and kind of apparently leapfrogging in this idea that we're now, is because of the Elon Musks of the world wanting to go to Mars. And I think for me, I got the opportunity. I reached out. I read many articles probably many of the same articles that you've been reading about political issues regarding a future Martian settlement. And one of the people I came across was Jacob Haqq-Misra, who is uniquely focused on the issue of sovereignty, the sort of sovereignty of a Martian settlement. And he has a lot of ideas, essentially, and I was able to contact him, and he's a researcher at the Blue Marble Space Institute of Science. And in contacting him, I was able to become a visiting scholar there, particularly on these issues of politics and the Martian settlement, which was a great opportunity for me because, and maybe it's somewhat surreptitious, but I'm not trying to be. There's this amazing opportunity to, and Jacob talks about this, about the ability for a Martian civilization to kind of to change Earth, to show what a society that we can that is not going to have the issues of colonization like that. There's always a tendency to call it a Mars colony, and it's not a Mars colony. It's going to be a Mars settlement. It's not going into some place and stealing land and resources and bringing it back to Earth to enrich people or to begin the accumulation process that gets us the capitalist system or something like that. It isn't. It's a very different process, one that we can be very self-conscious about creating, and that can, in that process, reflect back on Earth values that are so often subsumed by other very often nefarious incentives and disincentives, and a perverse set of things that motivate people in terms of this desire for profit's sake, and the relationship between wealth and power, and the care or lack of care that you have for the Earth and its resources, and the precariousness of it ultimately. And so I was really taken by that. I thought, yes, we need to do two things at the same time. Take into account the considerations of what will be necessary in terms of the actual physical situation on Mars. That there's obviously it's very different than the Earth. And I think from a very traditional Marxist position, the material conditions of a person's life or a society's life is going to affect its political, social, cultural, and economic development. And Montesquieu, a very famous political philosopher, talked about how different people in different climates are going to ultimately produce different political cultures, because things are different there, and people will sort of be different. And I think it doesn't take much to look around the world and see that, genetically we're like 99.9 the same, but culturally we're very different. But then at the same time we're existing on this there's like on the top of it, in some ways there's all these differences, but at the same time we're much into community and solidarity, and we have a competitive nature. We have these different aspects that all of us have, but that they exist in this cultural, for lack of a better term, situation that is very much dependent on where we live, what resources are available, and all of those kinds of things. And so I think my sort of perspective is just what I've come to is I've been writing this paper on the considerations that we need to take into account when thinking about what is actually a Martian settlement is going to be like. The main difference, obviously, there are two differences. One, on the issue of sovereignty, it's, at minimum a 3.5 month, if you're really close, trip. At most, it's like a 9-month, transit time, which is similar, but even still longer than the transatlantic back in the day when that was, a 3-month trip. Communication will obviously be quicker, but still limited by literal light speed. You're about 20 minutes. You can't immediately you can't have a video call with Mars because it's too far away. And so the ability for any real control of what happens internally in a Martian settlement for Earth is only going to be possible based on the ability for Earth to remove continued supplies, so long as those continued supplies are actually necessary. And I think ultimately many people who have thought about what the goal of the settlement on Mars would be is self-sufficiency. But there's going to be a period of time in which you're not self-sufficient. And so you're going to be dependent on Earth for resources, basic necessities of life. And so for that period of time, there will have to be an interesting relationship between Earth and the Martian settlement because of the need for the people in the settlement to getting resources from Earth. But that said, at some point, there's going to be an independence moment where you're no longer dependent on resupplies from Earth. And at that point, sovereignty and independence is de facto the case. And so as we think about it, it needs to also be sort of de jure the case, where we have a legal mechanism by saying, okay, we're separated now and we're on our own and we are going to create our own system. And so I think knowing that it's important for us to, even before we go, and I saw an article today, maybe you saw it too, that Elon Musk says that he'd be surprised if we're not on Mars in 5 years, which is a short period of time. And those people are probably going to stay. And so you're talking about the beginnings of a settlement in 5 years. So we need to be discussing about what the interactions between those people are going to be, who's going to be in charge, how do we determine those kinds of things, because it's going to matter right away, because there's nobody on Earth who's going to be able to change that. And so those are, some of the things, even just before you get into the nitty gritty of the kind of resource constraints and things like that, that I think is why this discussion is extremely necessary. And so I'll give you the chance to respond, I guess. But the frustration I feel, or the frustration I imagine that you have with those who may be short-sighted in the sense of thinking that this is far off and this is a kind of fantasy land situation. It's really not. It's very close. And the questions that you're asking are very important questions for at least a certain set of our fellow human beings who are going to be, a long ways away from us, and but they're still, our fellow humans, and we owe it to them and to ourselves to ask the right questions and to think about these things before we just do what human beings have done most of our existence, which is jump before, leap before we look. And I think that that's it's a significant danger to not only the people who are going to be on Mars, but us back on Earth, because what's going to happen there is going to reflect on us. It's going to be this potential beacon of what would be possible in even the most strenuous situations. And if it can succeed and thrive and create an equitable society, it'll reflect back and help us do the same thing on Earth. But if it fails and if it becomes this authoritarian nightmare, it also will reflect back on Earth, and it will empower the worst angels of our nature rather than the better angels of our nature. And so I wanna encourage you to continue to push back against those people who are suggesting that this is somehow not important or not, not worth it, because it really is. So I don't know what you think about that spiel or not, but.
Well, I just want to thank you for all of those thoughts and what you just said, because I agree 100% with everything you said. And I did read your essay, and it was just I was so taken by it, because it had so many important points that I was like, exactly, like this is exactly what I think. And it was interesting because the more I kept reading it, when I had questions, like it would be answered later in the essay. And I was like, oh, he has it all covered. So, but I really enjoyed reading your essay. And yeah, I think it's just really interesting because I don't know if you've heard of the movie Don't Look Up. It just recently came out, but it's essentially about this group of scientists. So this is low-key like a spoiler alert, but it was so funny because I didn't even know what it was about until I went to go see it. But like these scientists are studying like this meteor is going to come and crush Earth and kill everything.
That's like Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence and stuff.
Nobody's taking it serious. Nobody. They're like, nah, like whatever. And then it shows the whole system, like the governing systems, the politics, that everything is dependent on the power of the people in the situation. And they were only willing to address it if it fit their agenda. But otherwise they were like, I don't think so. Like space is far away. And then bam, like it happens. And so that's how I see space and Martian settlement is it's going to take very specific and thoughtful strategy to make sure that when settlement does happen, that it happens right. And as you're saying, it's going to influence Earth. And if we want to have good influence on Earth, we need to kind of address what we can do strategically right now to make sure that the people or the individuals that go to Mars are going to have like the knowledge and ability and like capacity to build life based on, I think a question that came up for me is, would the need and the necessity to focus on rebuilding the world there and rebuilding a way of living, would that bridge the gaps between people that might have differences in culture and differences in regards to perspective? Would that be a big enough thing to be like, okay, we're all focusing on survival and recreation, and that's going to be our new value and our new goal? And we're not going to have all these issues, even though we're a smaller amount of people, but we'll be able to get along as a group of people to make decisions together because we all have the same goal in mind. Whereas on Earth, it's such a competitive society. That's where everyone gets into this, I need to have the most, I want to be the best, I want the most power. So that's kind of a question that came up for me a lot.
Yeah, I think, and I'm sure you saw it in the essay too, but there is this notion, I think, on Earth, that one of the things that I'm gonna really focus on and probably flesh out a little bit more in the paper is this difference between the abundant scarcity and the acute scarcity. So scarcity is always this word that is used by all economists to essentially justify the field of economics, right? That we have a finite amount of resources, therefore we need to find the most efficient or the sort of the best, whatever that means, method to allocate resources so that we can achieve a goal. And so, and the question is always, what is the goal? And the goal will then determine what mechanisms we use to decide how we're going to allocate these resources. That question is more, the goal can be a little bit, I think, different, right? It can be either growth or like full distribution of basic needs, or you can have different things because we are not in almost anything engaged in an acute scarcity situation. So yes, we know ultimately that the world has a finite amount of air and a finite amount of land and a finite amount of like water and helium and all these things. And that's true. And we all kind of know it. But it's not as if we encounter acute scarcity very often. Maybe in a situation of famine, which in many ways, because of technology and agro industry and things like that, we're almost well past in terms of, in principle, the ability to distribute food to even famine areas is more than available. The only reason there is any famine right now is because they're artificial in many ways. And so there's some things that there's a lot of things, frankly, that are post scarcity on Earth. The ability to generate even sufficient energy, food, water. We can have desalination. That'll we've got oceans and stuff like that. And so when it comes to even land, I mean, land is ultimately finite, but there's a lot of it. And if you can sustainably, there's this whole notion of, Maslowian, the notion that population is the issue, right? That we got to keep the population growth is the problem of humanity. And yeah, it's pretty crazy that we've been able to grow at the rate that we have. And there is on sustainability of it in principle, but there is a significant amount of land, and we could much more rationally use that land and distribute the goods of that land in a way that would not make it scarce even as we continue to grow. And so that allows us, or that has created a situation in which we don't necessarily feel forced to allocate in a specific kind of planned, rational way. That we have allowed a system to develop that is intentionally anarchic, that is based on relationships between people that are not equal, that are very divergent in different places, and we have ultimately kind of accepted it because it hasn't always produced situations where it has seemed untenable. I think for me, the real insight in terms of even the Marxist tradition, in terms of its critique of the capitalist system, is that you're taking a system that, markets can be anarchic, but the mode of production, the way that we actually decide how we produce things, and the incentive structure that comes into how you produce things and where you produce things and what you do with the actual production things that you produce, is also it's in some ways highly controlled and then thrown into an anarchic situation, producing situations of like overproduction where we actually are too rational in some places, and those cause what amount to artificial crises because we're not rationally deciding how we're doing these things, and we're letting it be subject to market-based, essentially, interactions between people, which markets are not, as you've even said, they are not necessarily human interactions. They're artificial. It's an artificial way of relating human beings to human beings, mediated through this, as you said, transactional kind of thing, that we're not engaged with each other for our genuine mutual benefit and so that we can all succeed properly. But we justify this system to ourselves because we'll say ultimately, this sort of Adam Smith notion that ultimately, if we all just pursue our self-interest, the invisible hand, whatever that is, of the market will properly allocate resources. And to a certain degree, the resources can get allocated, but it's not hard to look at the world and say, well, they don't get allocated in a way that satisfies everybody's basic needs at minimum, right? Or that can even allow people to not only satisfy their basic needs, but freely participate, to decide for themselves what it is that they want to do, unconstrained by the need to, especially in the United States of America, access healthcare, access housing, because all of these things are still commodities in a market that uses a weirdly fluctuating price mechanism in order to determine the allocation. And so when we're looking, so there is this, it's hard to see the real pressure of needing to move away from that until you hit a crisis mode, right? So until there is a 2008 crash, which produces an Occupy movement or something like that, it's not always visible for us to see that the system that we live in produces situations of acute scarcity. When you look at the situation of Mars, it's ever present all the time. Acute scarcity is the fundamental material condition of everyone who's going to live on Mars for a while, a long time, until there is going to be sufficient development of internal production and ways of at least minimal terraforming and things like that. And so that mandates a plan and rational, strict methods of distribution and production. And so there is that long used and often sort of cringed at, or maybe laughed at, or sometimes lauded after phrase of from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. And that has become a trope in a world that appears to be abundantly scarce, but it will have to be. I can't imagine a situation in which, like, the frustration I've had in researching doing like a literature review on people who have talked about political situations on Mars is that, one of the main things is this Cato Institute, a very sort of right-wing libertarian kind of organization that did this white paper back in the late 90s that was making all kinds of claims that, like, yep, we just take what exists on Earth and we just use markets because they're perfect, and like just put a market on Mars and everything will be fine. And ironically, Elon Musk in the one of the Starlink contracts that came out in a sort of beta version of the contract for his space-based internet provision, made a claim about Mars and said, Mars is a free planet. And there was some controversy about that. Like, people were like, what the hell does that mean? Like, fucking Mars a free planet? What are you talking about? And if you go to that Cato paper, that's the exact words that they use in that paper. So there's this assumption that we'll just be able to grab what exists on Earth and place it on Mars. And it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what of what's going to be necessary to actually survive on Mars. And I think that many times we have this view of planning and rational planning in terms of the Gauss plan of the Soviet Union, where you'd have this giant bureaucracy who just says, like, yep, we need X amount of tons of coal and X amount of tons of meat, and then we'll just we'll put it out there and people will get it, and then we think of bread lines and misallocation of resources and things like that. Now, in one sense, I find that a bit dubious because, to be honest with you, much of that rational planning did a lot to increase people's standard of living and all that kind of stuff in a situation which was a country that was already economically well behind the rest of Europe, and then went through a world war which devastated it, and then a civil war which devastated it, and within 30 years was one of the world's foremost superpowers and was crucial to defeating the Nazi regime, which had used the industrial capacity of one of the most advanced industrial countries in the world. And so that's not necessarily an apology for Stalin, but I think we ought to keep things in mind that planning really works. And when you look at Amazon or large corporations, they're planning. They're doing rational planning to be able to deliver the vast amounts of services and things like that they do. And so the question, I think, when I think about this is not, will there need to be planning, economic planning, in terms of the both production and distribution of resources in a Martian settlement? There will have to be. So the question then becomes not will there be a plan, but who makes the plan and how does that work? And I think, to me, that's where we get into interesting questions of design, in terms of what it is that we're going to create in our political structures. And again, much of the literature just assumes that Well, we just implant what we've done on Earth, right? So we'll have an executive and a judiciary and a legislature, and everything will be fine. And one, I mean, I can't remember exactly how many people they're talking about being able to put on a starship and land it on Mars, but probably less than 20 at the beginning, so maybe 10. And I think, like you said, so much of the focus has been on the people that will go with their kind of technical expertise. What's going to be their, there's going to be a doctor, there's going to be, and we've seen that in many like the shows that have looked at, there was that Mars TV show, I think on Netflix that, where they went into a regolith, and a very good show, but didn't talk about the political structure at all. Everybody just had their little place and everybody was cool with it. That's not how human beings are going to be. Even if you're a doctor and you're a geologist and you're a botanist, and you're going to also need to interact socially and politically, and you need to decide who gets what and how. And I think many times it's just either not considered or either taken for granted that that's going to have to be authoritarian. That there's this notion in a lot of people's minds of the marriage between authoritarianism and planning. And it's understandable. If you look at Amazon, it's a very authoritarian place. But it doesn't have to be, in my mind. I think that, one of the other podcasts that I do is called All Things Co-op. And the worker cooperative model is, I think, a real example of the ability to have a democratic plan, to be able to marry what has been often touted as divergent ideas of genuine participation, meaningful participation in the things that affect you, that relate to a fairly strict and orderly plan. And so when you're talking about emergency procedures, right, you're going to need the kind of strict adherence to rules that would be close to a military kind of structure. But if there's only two ways that you're going to ever be able to get that level. It's going to be brute force, which you can't sustain on Mars because every individual you lose is a production element, like somebody who's doing some necessary aspect of production that, to each according to their ability, you're losing that. And so you can't allow a brute force, I'm going to kill you if you don't do it kind of threat. You need to have a different model to do it. And so the only way, at least in our experience on Earth, that we've gotten individuals to be able to genuinely commit to a plan is when they have a say in the plan and a seat at the table. Because if you don't have a seat at the table, you don't feel like you have any reason to participate, like to adhere to the plan when it's necessary to put it out or to carry it out. And when you're talking about even not only an emergency situation of a puncture, and the air is leaving, but just who's getting what and when, you got to be able to adhere to that, or the society will, on Mars in particular, will just not long survive. And so my view, and I'm curious your perspective on this, is just we don't have a choice ultimately, and we need to come to terms with the fact that authoritarianism is not an option. We can't do what they have proposed on The Expanse, which is a hardcore military dictatorship on Mars, because it will never get off the ground. It has to be a democratic and also centralized system. And I do think ultimately that that's possible. And I think it's actually more probable and easier in a situation of acute scarcity, because ultimately you won't have a choice. That there's this kind of implicit acceptance of this necessity. But the ability to participate makes it meaningful. That it's not, you're not being forced into this situation, that you're sort of choosing to accept the limitation. But the building of a new social contract means I'm accepting the limitations of the fact that I'm not going to be able to get everything that I want all the time, but I can still participate in how we decide what we produce, how we produce it, and ultimately who gets what. And so we have models that exist on Earth that will be able to provide good examples of what we can do on Mars. I think for me, the frustration I have is that people have not been honest about what this situation is going to really present. And so I'm curious if that's been something you've thought about, or what you kind of think about that perspective.
Yeah, well, while I was kind of exploring what I really wanted to center my thesis around, I always had the Martian settlement as kind of like, that's like my central focus. That's what I want to ultimately address at the end. But on the pathway to getting towards that, I was looking at design and just design as a whole. And if you look at the world, like everything has been designed. And you look at all the inequity and injustice that comes with the design of the world. And that kind of got me to probe the idea of, what if we could redefine design? What if we looked at design a different way? What if we educated designers in a different way? And that's kind of where I came up with my Allyson model. Is I had been working on a project with the city health department, and something I'd asked them is, I was studying the social determinants of health, and I agree there's sometimes controversy of who created the social determinants of health, who really defined what that is. But for me, it was just kind of a universal standard of health. So what does every human body need to be in a safe place, or to have the core necessities provided for them to have the life that a human being deserves? And I'd asked the city health department, why is there so much, why is in design there's so much lack of social determinants of health? Why don't we create designs that embody the human wellness and the well-being of a person when it's so inaccessible? Even if you look at things like healthcare, even libraries, education, it's so inaccessible to so many people. And that brings you to the question, like, who designed this and why? And who put these people in the power to design, and who contracted these people to design? And so I came up with the Allyson complex to kind of show that, like, the power of design rests in the middle. And as designers, we have the ability to go down, which would lead to like decay and what I call corruption, which is just kind of leading to injustice and inequity and inaccessibility, and then going up, which is the high point, which Allyson is like, it means kind of characteristics of heaven, and utopia, which is kind of the ultimate, some people say impossible, but that's like the ultimate, like what you could achieve to be like your ideal. But then in the middle, having design that embodies like the social determinants of health. I had studied bioethics, and like one of the terms I'd come across was the universal prescriptivism. What I do to others, I would reflect on myself. How would I feel if they did that to me? And that's kind of what I was looking at design. And I said, what if we looked at design differently? What if we could create a system where, like you're saying, participatory design and open design, where communities and individuals were part of the plan, we're part of the process of what's going to happen? Because when I was looking into urban planning, I was like, a lot of this is based on what we as designers see as a necessity for this area, but you don't actually go in and ask the people that live there. And that's where a lot of the implemented buildings or structures they don't serve the people that live there, just because we see it as what we want to see it. And a big part of design is beauty. And we're so focused on building things that are beautiful that we forget about the functionality and the accessibility. And so that's kind of where I had gone. So I really agree with that I think people should be part of the processes. One of my ideas had been coming up with, for urban design and urban planning, like a gamified architecture, because I was trying to investigate like Minecraft, relating urban planning to Minecraft. How come so many people in the world, they can build their ideal or their kingdoms or their houses on a video game? But what would that look like in real life? What would that look like if you gave humans the power to do or interact in something similar to build their neighborhoods or their cities? And there had been controversy among my colleagues of, no, you should not be putting that responsibility onto people because they have their lives. But at the same time, if we as designers don't change the way that we look at design, and like the whole political system doesn't look at the way that we look or contract design, then we're going to keep designing inequitably and unjustly. And that's kind of what I was trying to provoke. And it didn't receive a lot of yeah, I didn't have a lot of fans when I presented this. It was kind of it stirred the pot a little bit, but it was something I was trying to showcase that we really need to address ourselves because we're all part of this.
Yeah, the first point I would make is that it's been my experience that a lack of acceptance or general acceptance, particularly in academia, usually tends to mean that you're on the right track rather than the wrong one. So don't get too discouraged by that. Hearing you talk, have you heard of David Harvey? Okay, so David Harvey is a sociologist, and the other podcast I do, All Things Co-op, is part of this larger Democracy at Work network. And David Harvey is brilliant, but he was like mostly a sociologist, and but focused on a lot of like urbanization, questions of urbanization, but from a very, we might, the academia will call it critical, I'll just call it Marxist perspective, but very much in a similar kind of asking a lot of the questions that you're asking, and really saying, looking at the development of urban areas and why urban areas are developed the way that they are, and the question of things like the slum and all of these different things. Why do they exist and how do they, to me, just the development of a favela to me is kind of an incredible thing. And having walked through areas in India and areas in Colombia and other places, the lack of a real obvious participatory design and a kind of just haphazard, oh my God, we have to put something up because it's raining and I need a roof, creates a place that's degrading other aspects of what it means to be a human. It really has all of these downstream effects, we might say, that are significantly, that aren't just about beautification, which is what a lot of urban planning has been focused on and stuff like that. It's not that. It's about how it relates to what it is to be a human in this place and with all of these other people, especially in that kind of urban setting. And so he also has an entire way of, or a whole a way to understand Marx's Capital, which to me, even as somebody who's really into it, is still one of the hardest things I've ever had to read and understand. And he makes it easy to read or easy to understand. And so the guy's brilliant, and he's got a good podcast on the Democracy at Work channel and stuff like that. An Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, I think he calls it. I don't remember, but smart guy, would I think be very much worth checking out from your perspective, because I think you're right on. I think what we often see, going back to even the Mesopotamia and Rome and Tenochtitlan and other places, is this representation of power in the way that people live, in what they live in and how they do things. And I think, to me, I will be somewhat Western bias in my focus on maybe Rome or something. But when you look at, even having walked the streets of Rome, you're intentionally in awe. The point is to make you go, wow, holy shit, this place is I don't want to mess with this. Somebody's got a lot of capital and the ability to use that in whatever way that they want. And there's an intentional projection of social stratification, and when you see in the exterior of you see this inner city that's beautiful and filled with all this monumental architecture, and you see all of the outside, which is where everybody who does all the work lives, and it doesn't have that category, and it's haphazard, and it's dirty, and it doesn't, and then in some ways, as you fast forward into the development of something like a suburb and those kind of things, and the intentional rational planning as an example of actually attempting to atomize and both individuate and, disambiguate in some ways, to make every little boxes in a row, and I think they almost all, what it does is, and I'm very way too much sounding like a Marxist right now, but whatever. It's the Sensible Socialist podcast. It's really this class nature of our societies and how deep these divisions go. I mean, they go into, every aspect of our life, in terms of how we get our food and what we eat and when we eat and where we live and how we get to where we get to. It's all representation of the fact that somebody usually decides, a few people, and maybe sometimes one person decides for a lot of people, things that are significant aspects of their life. And I think one of the things that has always pushed me into the more critical and the more radical and even revolutionary is the fact that we can't piecemeal our way out of that kind of thing. That every attempt that we've made even to like shift that has really just shifted it. It has not fundamentally upended it. And we need that. We are, as we approach things like environmental degradation, I think when I think about design, it's like we're going to be building new aspects of cities and even probably new cities eventually, specifically dealing with issues of climate change, because we're forced to. And if we don't have an ability and a mechanism to participate in those construction projects, they will themselves maintain this hierarchy and this authoritarian nature of the way that we live our lives and construct our societies. And so, there's always been a kind of criticism of highfalutin socialist theories of like the new socialist man, and everybody kind of like laughs at this or like whatever, and Che Guevara wrote Man and Socialism in Cuba, like, oh, we're developing a new human being, and everybody kind of goes, what, human? Because there is this notion, I think a very deep notion in a lot of areas, that humanity is fixed, that we do not change, and that we have never changed, and we are, I think in many ways the whole field of evolutionary psychology and even evolutionary biology is a bit of a propaganda machine to just say, yep, like you evolved to be on the savannah and you're just the same thing throughout history. And I don't agree with that. I think that we have shown ourselves to be highly adaptable, highly capable, and to be able to rise to the moment when the situation calls for it. And I do think as we barrel towards environmental degradation and I think potential social collapse, both as a result of that, but also even just economic factors. I mean, it's a pretty wild thing to see people storming the Capitol of the United States of America, because that doesn't happen very often as it does in other places. And so this is a question of the long-term survival of our species. And it's going to depend on a radical change. And it's going to be, the way that we express that radical change is not going to just appear. It needs to be thought about beforehand. It needs to be proposed and understood in a way that I think a lot of people actually want. As somebody who advocates for socialism, the thing I hear the most often is, well, I know what you're against, but what are you for? And I think that's one of the powers of even that your Elysium model. You're talking about something you're for. This is moving from understanding. One of Marx's famous quotes is, all philosophers before have just interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. And I think that's even what I hear you presenting is that, well, there's lots of people who talk about the theory of design and why people design things in different ways and how we can understand how structures interact. And that's all interesting stuff and useful. But if that doesn't put you in a position to propose something, to be able to say, there's a contradiction in our design process, like you're talking about. There's something that doesn't work in this design, the way that we're doing the design, and it's causing us to have to, causing, in some ways, producing bad designs for human beings and for long-term sustainability and equitability and things like that, that you can rest there and go, well, I don't know, it's just bad, I guess. Or you can say, no, I have a theory and I have a proposal and I think we should go here. And that's the real value. That's where you move out of mere academia, where you sit in your ivory tower and scratch your beard and go, isn't the world interesting? And get down on the streets and really make social change, which every year and every moment is becoming more and more necessary. And so in some ways, I know we're approaching the end of this. I don't want you to get the kind of last word, but I 100% support what you're doing. Don't be discouraged by anyone who poo-poos the idea that not only of a different theory and proposal of design, but its application in what is not a far long future, but is coming very quickly, and a potential way of making important and radical changes here on Earth. So continue what you're doing. You're doing, I wouldn't say God's work, because that's not what I'm into, but you're doing, the right work. Let's put it that way.
Well, thank you very much for meeting with me and connecting with me. I was super inspired by your work, and I was told when we got connected, I was like, oh my gosh, he sounds so cool. And yeah, I definitely agree with you. I told everyone for my thesis, they were like, you think too big, like it's too big. And I'm like, I don't care. Like, I strive for the revolutionary and radical. I was talking to an engineer about their work, and I was saying that they said, like, because they're in Mexico, and they were like, provocar, like, we want to provoke people. And I said, that's how I feel too.
Yep.
I want to provoke people. So that's what I want to do. And I hope maybe we can continue conversations, or if you would ever be willing to pass along like any books you think I should maybe read or text, I would really love that.
Yeah. I think that I'll even, because I do the podcast that is in the umbrella with David Harvey too, I'll reach out to the powers to be and see if I can get a direct connection to David and see if I can connect you two, because I think that'd be just, I think, fun for both of you to, I won't, not to be ageist or whatever, but David's getting up there, and I think that there's probably a desire to want to pass some mantles and to be able to really have somebody. I think a lot of people love David for his capital and his kind of sort of general perspective, but I think somebody who's interested in the question of design and even sort of cities and that kind of stuff would really touch his heart. So I am more than happy to be a resource for you. I think that you can easily be a resource for me. And so I absolutely think this should be the first of many conversations. And, I've taken a long break from this podcast, but these are the kind of conversations I really love having, that inspire me. And I'll tell you, it's been one hell of a week for me, and this conversation has really perked me up out of a bit of a slump. And so I'm in that sense indebted to you. So I really appreciate it. And email me anytime. We'll talk anytime you want to, and I'll be more than happy to even reach out to anybody who's pushing back on you to say thinking big is what's necessary now, and if we're not thinking big, you're not doing enough.
Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate you too.
Awesome. Well, the first of many conversations, and we'll do it again.
Yeah, talk to you soon.
All right, thanks a lot. Bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right, see you next time.